Assalamu alaikum. I pray everybody's doing well. How is the picture and the sound?
Yes, alhamdulillah, everything's going good.
Okay, very good. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for starting the meeting. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa sallallahu ala Muhammad wa sallam taslima. Alhamdulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Good to see everybody. We are going to go ahead and get started. Inshallah, what I'm going to do is I'm going to administer a quick reading quiz, and then inshallah, we're going to have the rest of the presentation. So happy to see everybody from last week. And if you'll just bear with me, because this is my first time actually doing this over Zoom. So we're going to see how this goes, inshallah ta'ala. And so this is going to be a Kahoot. It's got 5 questions. And the what you're going to do, inshallah, is you're probably going to go to kahoot.it and be able to kind of see this on your end of the on your end of the screen. So inshallah, let's kind of give this a go. All right, let's do this. So easy questions, mainly from the reading that I assigned by Dr. Abdullah Hakim Quick, but also based upon lecture from last time as well. And just to kind of bring us up to speed. Also, if there are any questions from last time, let me know. I've been looking at the feedback. Thank you so much for providing that. It was super helpful to see that feedback. So again, welcome to our group. And going to share my screen in just a moment, inshallah ta'ala. All right. Okay, so everybody ready? Okay, these should be pretty easy questions. Okay, Bismillah. All right, so let's do this. Let's see, can I share? Okay, so this is what everyone's going to see. Okay, so we're going to go to play, start. Okay, let's try this. Okay, so if you go to kahoot.it, you can do this on your device, on your laptop, or on your phone. And there is a pin that you're going to enter. Just 5 quick questions to get us started. Okay, so you go to kahoot.it, or if you have the app on your phone, you enter that pin and it should take you to the quiz that I've just created. So we'll just give everybody a moment, inshallah, to kind of come into the room here. Okay. So we begin in the name of Allah Ta'ala, most gracious, most merciful. All praise is due to Allah Ta'ala, who is Lord of the world. And we ask Allah to send his peace, blessings, and salutations upon our beloved Prophet Muhammad and his family's companions. Ameen. All right. So waiting for everybody to almost there. I think we've got about 45 participants today. So that, alhamdulillah, just to give everybody a moment to get into the room. All right. So I think this is going to work because basically the idea is that you all get access to the quiz, you answer the questions, and it's going to have a little podium at the end to kind of tell us who is like in first, second, third place. All right, almost there. Actually, we have 50 participants. Excellent. Okay, just giving everybody a minute, and then we're going to go ahead and hit the start button. Okay. All right, so if you haven't joined the room, let me know if you're having any tech issues. Otherwise, I'm going to be starting the quiz in just a moment now. Oh, looks like we're still joining. Okay, awesome. So are we going for full participation, inshallah? Okay. Alhamdulillah. All right, everybody ready for me to start? Yes, no? We good to go? Someone wants to put in the chat, thumbs up, thumbs down? Okay. People are still joining. Okay, awesome. So in the interest of time, I am going to go ahead and start the quiz. All right. So Bismillah. All right. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. 5 and 4 and 3 and 2 and 1. I'm going to hit the start button. Bismillah. Okay. A quick little quiz, just 5 questions. Okay, so if you had a chance to look at the article, where off the coast of the Americas was a cache of Mediterranean coins found, potentially? These are your options: Cuba, Mexico, Venezuela, or Brazil. Okay, Bismillah. Let's see. As you can see, it's timed, counting down. Okay, very good. Alhamdulillah. And yes, the correct answer, according to our article by Dr. Abdullah Hakim Quick, was Venezuela. So intriguing. These were mainly Roman coins, but they found some coins from the Arab world amongst them. All right, so very interesting. All right, who got here and brought that cache of coins? Very interesting question. Okay, so in the lead, mashallah, we have the following students. Let's go to the next question. Okay, so this one, which Muslim geographer wrote about a 12th century expedition to the Americas? Was it Al-Idrisi, Al-Biruni, Al-Balkhi, or Al-Mas'udi? So this is fun. We actually get to do this on a Zoom. Okay. And yes, it was Al-Idrisi, very interesting person. This was a Muslim geographer active in the 11th and 12th centuries. He's so good, he ends up getting hired by King Roger of Sicily. By that time, Sicily is back in Christian hands, and he writes about an expedition that potentially left the Mediterranean or I should say the African coast to actually go to the Americas. Very interesting. Again, this was in the article by Dr. Quick. Okay, Al-Idrisi, very famous geographer. I'll show the Idrisi map in just a second, inshallah. It's not part of my official presentation, but I teach classes in Islamic geography. It's a really, really nice map. Okay, very good. Now let's go to the next question.
By the way,
So
Ustad
now,
inshallah, the winner of this will be getting a gift card. So just
thank you, brother.
mistakes for the last few questions.
Okay, all right. Jazakallah khair. Thank you. That's very generous. Here's our next question, simple true or false. In Dr. Quick's article, in the early 20th century, a map of the Americas dating back to the 16th century was found in a library in Istanbul. True or false? Around 1929, a map was found in Istanbul, potentially. Is this true or false? What do you all think? And the belief is that the map dated back to sometime in the 1500s. Excellent. Yes, a map was found in Istanbul with an intriguing reference to a potential expedition, probably around 10th century or so. Or I should say probably, I'm sorry, this was actually 10th century AH, which is like 15th century or so, or 16th century CE. It was AH and CE. All right, hinting at possible Muslim exploration of that region. Really, really interesting. Okay. Very good. Now let's go ahead and look at our next question. So in the lead, we have Sister Alia. Excellent. All right. Wrapping up, which ethnic group did Musa belong to? You know, he was the brother of King Abu Bakr. Hausa, Fulani, Mandinka, or Yoruba? All right, almost there. Counting down, 3, 2, 1. And the correct answer is yes, he belonged to the Mandinka ethnic group. All right, excellent. And our last question in the lead, mashallah, Sister Alia. All right, here is our last question. The earliest African presence in North America dates back to 1719. True or false? And we are counting down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, drum roll. So the correct answer, false, because very good, you all caught that. The earliest African presence in North America dates back to 1619, hence the 1619 project. Very good. So let's see who is in first. Well, actually, I'm going to go to third, second, and first. So in third place, we have KO. All right, good work, Sister Sadia. KO, brother, sister, don't know. And then in first place, we have, drum roll, Sister Alia. So you are the recipient of a prize from Brother Hussam of Al-Hidaya Center. Awesome. And we've got our runners up listed below. Okay, so alhamdulillah, that was kind of fun. Okay, let me just go ahead and switch off the Kahoot. And alhamdulillah, let's go ahead and get started with our lesson for today. All right. So Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I just want to acknowledge our wonderful group of students from last week, and stop me if anything is unclear, by the way, because I was looking at the feedback and got some really great feedback from our group here, and very diverse group, mashallah. And I tend to use, just as kind of a force of habit, I tend to use Arabic phrases here and there. So if anything is unclear, go ahead and stop me, because again, we have a wonderful diverse group from different backgrounds, and I want to make sure to acknowledge our participants. And if there is anything I can kind of unpack that wasn't quite clear from last time, let me know. Otherwise, what we're going to be doing, inshallah, and please forgive me, I've got my presentation on this screen and then notes on another screen. But what I'm going to be doing here is sharing my slides, and we are going to jump right into the section on the antebellum South. So quick recap what we discussed last week. I kind of started in the present moment, and I presented the Ihsan Bagby Mosque report, which is a mosque report that's been issued now. Now it's being, mashallah, it's like 20 years or so. So where are we? We're in 2022, right? So beginning in 2000. So basically, as you can see, over 2 decades, Dr. Bagby has been researching the American mosque. That research has been really kind of instrumental in creating best practices for mosques, looking at women in mosques, attending, accommodating special needs and so on. So one of the very interesting developments, and also one that really kind of gave a lot of us pause, is that the profile of African-American mosques seems to be in decline. So Dr. Bagby was addressing some of the reasons for why that might be the case. And one of the things that Dr. Bagby has found is that mosques are increasingly diverse. That's one of the things that he found. With more mosques being located in the suburbs, is going to kind of affect mosques in the inner city. And he also found, which is pretty kind of demographic, kind of from a demographic standpoint, definitely something of concern, is that we're not quite seeing the robust patterns of conversion to Islam that really kind of characterize Islam in America for so many, really for so many decades. So that's where we kind of started with that piece, that overall, while there is a very strong and vital African American community, that that kind of profile of Islam in America being really indigenous to this land, being a religion of Americans, of African Americans in particular, with, again, robust patterns of conversion to Islam that is, in the decline somewhat. So I hope this class kind of helps us to kind of address how we can ourselves learn more about this history and be of support to the African American Muslim community. So I started from that piece. Then I kind of took us all the way back to the 15th century, where, as I noted, that one of the things that we might learn about, whether it's in high school or college classes on Western civilization, that often present sort of how modernity comes about. One of the things we learn is how Columbus sails west, ostensibly to find routes to the riches of the Far East. And we know that that is not something that happens by coincidence, that it is the 1492 expulsion of Muslims and Jews from the Iberian Peninsula from Islamic Spain that paves the way for the ascendancy, really, of Europe, because we know that the patron of Christopher Columbus is none other than Isabella herself. And of course, Ferdinand and Isabella are at the head of the Catholic Reconquista of Spain. The Spaniards come to the New World. It's hard to kind of discover a place where there are already people living and there are civilizations established. They come to the New World, as I mentioned last time. They interact with the indigenous peoples. And time again, Columbus and other explorers and conquerors are referencing in their writings, in their journals, the indigenous people. And they're making constant comparisons between those indigenous people of the Americas and the Moors, i.e. the Muslims that they've just recently expelled from Spain. In fact, some of the conquistadors coming over here were people that were kind of involved in direct kind of combat with Muslims in Spain. So that by the time we begin to see the arrival of slave ships, passing, that are undertaking the Middle Passage, bringing Africans enslaved from the coastal areas. Now we have the formation, the creation of really what is called the Atlantic world, a world that is very much shaped by commercial and mercantile concerns. It's going to be a world that really is fueled by plantation slavery. It's going to be a world that brings together Muslims, Christians, Jews to some extent, Africans, Europeans, and native peoples. So that's what we covered. And then I want to kind of bring us into the antebellum. And this is very interesting. This is going to be specific really to the United States, where I want to look at the antebellum period in history. Let me go ahead and share my screen now. And this, my dear brothers and my dear sisters, is when we see what I'm going to argue are really kind of like the earliest kind of formations of American Muslim communities, although I'm kind of using that term loosely simply because it is difficult for enslaved Africans to kind of aggregate kind of around certain identities given the fact they're enslaved. And I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. Let's go ahead and revisit our map. So this is, and by the way, Brother Hassan will be sharing not this presentation exactly, but the Islamic Networks group that actually first gave this presentation to me from Dr. Amar has a nice kind of summary of the history of Islam in America. It's actually designed as a curriculum for people that are working with middle and high school students, but I find that it's a really good introduction to the history of Islam in America for people who want kind of a quick introduction, where maybe you don't have time to get through a lengthy presentation or read kind of a book length treatment of the topic. I do have, inshallah, if you'll just give me a second here, I'm in my office back here. Let me just kind of scoot back here. Before I forget, Brother Hassam has also given you, emailed to you a bunch of resources from last week. I mentioned quite a few different articles, documentaries, and so on that you can view to learn more about the subject. But I always like to recommend books to help us learn about American history and the African American Muslim experience. This is the book that that I teach at Taysir Seminary, and this is definitely an academic tome. But it is really one of the most comprehensive. I think this is actually the most comprehensive look at the history of Muslims in America, History of Islam in America by Dr. Kambiz Ghani Basiri, a Persian American scholar, interestingly enough. And he got like, I think he obtained $100,000 grant from the Carnegie Foundation to actually write this book. So it's a really good book. I teach from it every year. And in this book, especially in the introduction, chapter 1, I think he does a really good job of kind of like grounding this history, kind of unpacking why this idea of the Atlantic world is so kind of important for our understanding of Islam in America. And I think I read from this last time, but I wanted to kind of recap a couple of things. Let me kind of go ahead and read this kind of excerpt here. And he talks about the idea of mercantile relations and imperial networks that Europeans create between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. How those mercantile relations and imperial networks, because remember, you have a whole host of European powers basically vying for dominance in the seas and in the slave trade. So he writes that these mercantile relations and imperial networks are going to lead to epic changes in global commerce, state administration, international relations, and conceptions of alterity, basically identity. And one of the things that Dr. Ghani Basiri finds in this book is that Americans, i.e. white Americans largely, are going to kind of struggle with how to sort of identify these enslaved Africans, that the Muslims that are enslaved on these shores are going to be sort of, they're going to present challenges in terms of how they are kind of identified and sort of kind of categorized, if you will, because their literacy, their command of the Arabic language poses certain challenges. So what this book does, again, I'm just kind of summarizing this for you. What this book does, it looks at basically two processes that the author identifies. He identifies a process of de-Negrification, is what he calls it, and de-Islamicization. And what he's going to say is that even though these enslaved African Muslims were very much people of color and Black people and Muslims, that there are going to be kind of efforts by those in power around them to sometimes downplay their Blackness when it suited them, or downplay their Islamic identity, largely kind of for political reasons. So what I want everybody to understand is that Muslims enslaved in the Americas, and especially in the United States, that they're not necessarily kind of navigating, you know, their circumstances always on their own terms. They have to be incredibly strong, resilient, and resourceful in how they kind of carve out a life for themselves and their families. I want us to think about that, you know, for those of us maybe who immigrated to this country, i.e., you know, coming to this country by choice is vastly different in how it allows you to navigate your circumstances versus being enslaved, thrown into the holding to these slave ships. I mentioned just the sort of horrors of the Middle Passage, that process, quote unquote, called seasoning, where often efforts are made to physically and psychologically break the person before they even get onto the slave ship, not to mention things that happen on those slave ships, not to mention what happens when you know, when enslaved Africans are brought to these shores. So now, inshallah, I'm going to be discussing, you know, Muslim presence in largely in the antebellum South. So what our presentation does, it introduces us to several very important people. We have Ayub ibn Sulaiman, or Job bin Solomon, from the early 1700s. We have Yaro Mahmud from the late 1700s. We have we have Prince Ibrahim ibn Abdurrahman, or Abdurrahman Ibrahima, as he's called, from the early 1800s, Omar ibn Said, early to mid 1800s, and Balali Muhammad, although that photo I don't think is actually a photo of Balali Muhammad. It's one that pops up when you Google him, but that one I'm not quite sure that's an accurate representation of him, from the early 1800s. So yeah, absolutely. Unless we definitely want to make dua for these spiritual forebears of ours. So inshallah, so that's really largely what tonight is going to do, is we're going to explore this antebellum period and look at Muslims that again try to eke out some kind of existence for themselves and their families amidst very harsh circumstances. And then we're going to consider kind of what happens after, like post-bellum, i.e. after the Civil War. What happens to the descendants of, you know, enslaved Africans? Is there any practice of Islam we can kind of visibly recognize? And that's going to bring us into the early 20th century, where I want to look at the proto-Islamic movements that emerged during that time, and also consider the role of early African-American Sunni movements. And keep in mind that my intention is not to exclude other groups. There are interesting Anglo-American converts to Islam that we see kind of late 19th, early 20th century. There's of course immigration from the Muslim world, but that's kind of beyond the scope of this class. You know, that what we really are focusing on are really the roots of Islam in America, which very much go back to our West African Muslim forebears. So for some additional reading recommendations. So like I said, there's this book right here by Dr. Kamiz Ghani Abasidi, which again, if you like academic tomes, it's super comprehensive, and I really love this book. But if you're really kind of interested in the age of exploration, here's another book for you. Hopefully you can see that, by David Abul Afia. His name sounds very Arabic. He's Jewish, and he writes this book called The Discovery of Mankind, Atlantic Encounters in the Age of Columbus. So this is really good if you want to understand those early formative years, again, before this country actually becomes the United States of America. And let's see, I've got something also related to that. This is a book that becomes a New York Times bestseller, I believe. Yeah. And this is by Jared Diamond. It's called Guns, Germs, and Steel. And in this book, basically, Diamond makes the argument that European dominance was not inevitable, that what Europeans coming to these shores possessed basically was, as you can see, technological and kind of like, well, they had technological advantages, and they also had the advantage of, well, what we would kind of call germ warfare. As I mentioned, when Europeans come to these shores, so it's a shocking 75 to 80% of the native population succumbs to disease, and in many to death, in many cases they are succumbing to disease because they are being exposed to old world diseases, for like smallpox, for which they have no immunity. So that's one of the things that that Diamond explores in this book. Let's see, other reading recommendations. I mentioned, here we are. Here's another one kind of along the lines of this, ecological imperialism. The author is Alfred W. Crosby, and he looks at ecological imperialism, the biological expansion of Europe from 900 to 1900. Right. And again, what he's going to look at is sort of how the very kind of environment, the flora, the fauna, the landscape is completely changed through colonialism. All right. And then last but not least, I mentioned this book. So this book has just come out. If you're kind of interested in sort of a larger engagement with kind of Islam and Blackness, then Sheikh Muhammad Adiyaka Mendes, who is now, mashallah, in West Africa, but who's teaching for Celebrate Mercy, recently concluded a series called Black Lives Around the Messenger, peace and blessings be upon him, called The Spirits of Black Folk, which is actually a commentary on an earlier work by Imam Suyuti, where he's actually kind of exalting or kind of praising the station of Black people in Islam. It's really, really, really quite fascinating. Okay, so Bismillah. So now to turn our attention to Muslims in the antebellum period. So the first thing that I want you all to consider here is, is sort of the kind of, as I said, this term community. And if we can kind of rightly argue that there are communities of Muslims in the antebellum South. So again, just to kind of, for those of you that are new to this class and this material, so just to give you a sense of where the United States is, it might actually be helpful. Let me see if I can, just give me 1 second here. I'm going to actually kind of pull up kind of a map. Okay. And this is going to take, we're going to be doing some US history here, obviously. And okay, so, all right, I think this might be helpful. Okay, just give me 1 second here. Okay, sorry, I'm just pulling up a map, just kind of like, so we kind of have a good reference here. Okay, sorry, I'm just kind of picking out which map I want. Okay, here we are, because I think the visual is helpful. Okay. So I want us to understand something. So if we were to kind of travel back to the United States, as you can see, late 19th century, this is a year before the Civil War breaks out. And I want you to kind of get a sense of how the United States looks during this time. So by the antebellum period, we are referring to the United States and specifically the southern states before the Civil War from 1861 to 1865. And, and despite despite protestations to the contrary, what I want you all to understand is that that in terms of why the Civil War was fought, again, 1861, 1865 is a timeline. In terms of why that Civil War is fought, it is very much fought around the issue of slavery. The issue of slavery is not secondary, it's not tertiary, because often people who want to kind of downplay sort of the kind of the role of slavery and emancipation, in sort of the prosecution of the Civil War will try to argue, if you're following these arguments, this is what kind of Republicans are saying these days, especially for those who want to ban critical race theory and they don't want to reckon with, the sort of sins of the past that definitely have an impact, on the present. They're going to basically say, oh, it was kind of over kind of economics. This was about sort of a kind of industrialized North kind of dominating a more kind of agrarian South. They're going to kind of make arguments about kind of sectionalism and sort of other things they're going to mention. But in reality, when Lincoln, who is the president at the time, and he's going to go down in history as really one of the greatest US presidents, he understands, as he says very famously, that a house that is divided against itself cannot stand, right? Half slave, half free, a house divided against itself cannot stand. So this is the world that enslaved African Muslims are a part of. This is a world where, again, this is quite unique in the kind of, and if you kind of do look at a history of slavery kind of globally, it is quite unique that you are going to have sort of a racial based system of slavery such that slavery becomes a heritable condition, i.e., the children are going to inherit the status of the mother. And this is how slavery becomes sort of perpetuated in the United States. And again, this is why, my dear brothers, my dear sisters, we see these debates today over critical race theory, because there are a lot of people for whom these discussions are very uncomfortable. And because these discussions are uncomfortable, they're trying their best to actually ban these discussions in actual classrooms. One of the things they don't want to reckon with is that as the 1619 Project really kind of unpacks, one of the things folks don't want to reckon with is the idea that the very founding fathers themselves are implicated in this system of chattel and plantation slavery. I mean, you have a founding father, Thomas Jefferson himself, who actually has a relationship with an enslaved young woman who probably is only around 14 years of age or so when that relationship starts, and he has multiple children with her, and those children are not emancipated. No, in fact, what happens is that you have basically two sort of family trees from Thomas Jefferson, right? You have the descendants who are kind of recognized as the legitimate heirs, and then you have the children that that he has with Sally Hemings, and they are obviously Jefferson's descendants. And DNA testing has shown that they are the descendants of Thomas Jefferson. That's the African American side of his family. So what I want you to understand is that this is, again, a situation where enslaved Africans are not navigating this world necessarily on their own terms, which is what makes their accomplishments that much more remarkable. So let me go ahead and go back to the slides, and let's kind of begin to explore some of the details about, about these remarkable people. So this is, we'll actually kind of start here with Omar ibn Said. So Omar ibn Said, there's a book here, A Muslim American Slave. I don't know if you all can see this, The Life of Omar ibn Said, that takes a look at the actual documents that he leaves behind. And by the way, one of the things I was really excited to find was, so he is, again, leaves behind an autobiography. You have to understand that it's actually illegal for slaves to read and write. And what Omar ibn Said does is he leaves behind an autobiography in the Arabic language. And that autobiography was acquired some years back, I think, by an African-American brother who was kind of collecting sort of old manuscripts. And I believe that, if I'm not mistaken, inshallah, I'll find the news story in just a second, but there's a university library that just recently acquired Omar ibn Said's autobiography. Just give me 1 second, inshallah. I'm actually going to grab some notes I made on that. So just 1 second. All right, so like I said, it's a lot of ground to cover, but I wanted to focus on Omar ibn Said and Bilali Muhammad in particular. And the reason I want to do that, as I mentioned, because these men are literate, there's going to be an effort by those kind of in power around them to figure out, what do we do with these people that are African, that are Muslim, and that are literate, because these men are going to defy assumptions about Africans. They're going to defy assumptions about sort of European civilization. What I want you to understand is that if we were to time travel back to, this period, the 1860s or so, right, 1850s, that we would see, we would find ourselves in kind of a prevailing political and social and cultural environment where people are going to argue that the very pinnacle of human achievement and civilization comes from white Anglo-Saxon Protestant America. All right, these are the arguments that are being made at this time. That if we were to go back to this time, and even in the early 20th century, we would find what is basically sort of eugenics, pseudoscience. We would find people that are researchers and scientists and writers that are actually arguing for the sort of the innate sort of genius and intelligence of Europeans. And what they are going to do is, again, this is how social science looks at this time. They are going to literally kind of map out human civilization and progress. And they're going to do this in a very kind of overt way, to where there's going to be kind of a hierarchy in terms of human advancement and civilization. At the very kind of top, right, at the pinnacle, at the very top of that hierarchy, what you are going to find are white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, right? A little bit further down, you're going to find Catholics. And then sort of, as you kind of go down that list, maybe under there, you might find some groups, from South Asia, maybe Aryan Indians, for example. These are terms that people are kind of using. And then as you kind of go down that hierarchy, at the very bottom, you are going to find people that they are going to sort of categorize as sort of savage and uncivilized. And that's where they are going to place Africans. And keep in mind that the reason why they are doing this is because if you are going to, against your own sort of conscience, if you are going to enslave an entire group of human beings, right? Let me actually ask you all this question. What do you have to do in order to actually so kind of deform your own sense of what's right to do that? What are you going to do to these human beings in order to justify this? Right? Can I get any responses to that question? Brother Hussam, or can the students use the microphone? Is that feature working? Let me know. Or we're using the chat box for this.
No, definitely they can. They just have to be a little brave and raise their hand.
Okay, awesome. So let me ask you all this, right? In order to justify chattel slavery, what are you going to do when it comes to these arguments about civilization and Europeans and Africans? What do you all think happens?
Okay, looks like
Yes,
someone raised and then lowered their hand.
Okay.
All right, we need at least one person.
Yeah, let me get a volunteer, whether it's from the reading or your own knowledge on this, right? I think all of us kind of have a sense of, right, absolutely. So here's some comments. You're going to make up lies about that group of people? Absolutely. Yes. So there's this idea that white Anglo-Saxon Protestants have that they are going to embark on a civilizing mission, right? They want to civilize these uncivilized people. They want to tame quote unquote these quote unquote savages. They want to Christianize them. So what I want you all to understand here is that Christianity, which of course becomes a hugely important religion for enslaved Africans, and does become ultimately, I think, in the hands of sort of Africans themselves. It's not that there is no kind of liberating potential. I don't want to say that there's none there, but what I want you to understand here is that Christianity, as imposed by the dominant group, i.e. white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, it does become this tool of suppressing and subjugating people of African descent. That Christianity is not something that Africans choose, but instead it's going to be imposed on them by the slave owner. Now, will Africans ultimately take expressions of Christianity and make that religion their own in a sense? Yeah, that's where the Black church comes from, a very important social and political and educational and spiritual resource for African Americans. But what I want you to understand is that early relationship between Africans, enslaved Africans and Christians is very fraught. Let me actually switch this. I want to give you an example right here. So here's another person that you might want to look up. His name is Edward Wilmot Blyden. And Edward Wilmot Blyden is somebody that, and again, his name is Edward Wilmot Blyden. Let me go ahead and just kind of write his name here. This is Edward Wilmot Blyden. And he originally came from the Caribbean. Here's his photo right here. And what's really interesting is that in the 19th century, what Blyden is going to do is he's going to look at Africa, and he's going to look at the role of Christianity, the role of Islam. And he writes this intriguing book called, as you can see, Christianity, Islam, and the Negro Race. And in this book, my dear brothers, my dear sisters, Blyden is going to make the argument that when it comes to sort of the benefit and welfare and the best interests of Africans, he's going to argue that Islam basically is more advantageous to Africans than Christianity. And he's going to make this argument on the basis of his own interactions with Christian missionaries, because he himself, I think he wants to go to theological seminary. He experiences discrimination, and he's actually going to look at sort of European and American Christian missionaries in Africa, and he's going to argue that they are not able to sort of interact with Africans on the basis of sort of eternity, or sort of on the basis of kind of fraternity, i.e. brotherhood and egalitarianism and equality. And instead that Christianity ends up being this sort of force for the subjugation of Africans. So he's going to argue, I think, well, this is some time ago, in the 19th, or I think early 19th century or so, if I'm not mistaken, he's going to argue that Islam is really kind of what has more of a liberative potential for Africans. So again, his name is Edward Wilmot Blyden, and this is a book that he writes. I think this is before the Civil War, if I'm not mistaken. I'll probably come back to this, but again, I just want to introduce this idea in terms of, if we were to time travel back to the 19th century, what ideas are we going to kind of find taking shape about Muslims in America, and specifically the enslaved African Muslims. All right, so here we have Omar ibn Said. So I'm going to share, I want to share kind of a couple, sort of a couple thoughts about the legacy of Omar ibn Said. And one of the things that I want us to consider about Omar ibn Said is that, in terms of his legacy, we can kind of think about this in terms of what's kind of called a narrative of disruption, a narrative of loss. Okay, so that's kind of how I want you to understand this with Omar ibn Said. And the reason why I'm calling this kind of a narrative of disruption, a narrative of loss, that you need to think about that, the fact that these men and women are going to be kind of taken out of their realities and transplanted into a foreign soil. And so what's going to happen to people like Omar ibn Said is that their experiences, their narrative is going to be kind of appropriated, kind of in the service of justifying slavery, justifying anti-Black racism, and Christian proselytizing. So let me give you an example of that. An example is that for those people that are kind of, and these are people that are contemporary to Omar ibn Said, when they kind of write about Omar ibn Said, they kind of have these blind spots. So you're going to see that often the contemporaries of these men, whether it's slave owners, whether it is missionaries, whether it is journalists, one of the things they're going to kind of argue is they're going to argue that these men are going to embrace Christianity, right? They will often do that. They will argue that these men are going to leave Islam behind and they are going to embrace Christianity. But what I'm going to suggest here is that if you actually look at the writings and the expression that these men leave behind, I don't believe that they actually left Islam for Christianity. Like I said, I think that they were attempting to navigate very difficult circumstances. So sometimes it might appear as if they had assimilated, but in reality, I really believe that people like Omar ibn Said, until the very end of his life, he remained a Muslim. So who was Omar ibn Said? So as it says here, he came from probably somewhere, he was a member of the Fula ethnic group. This is where I need more maps in this presentation. So this area was probably somewhere between present-day Senegal and Mauritania. And by the way, Omar ibn Said was quite learned. He, when he comes to the United States, he is someone who studied mathematics, astronomy, Islamic law, theology, and so on. And what happens is, so at this time, there are a lot of jihads taking place in West Africa, kind of raiding that's taking that takes place. And in the context of some of these raids, he is going to be captured and taken to the United States. And he ends up in South Carolina. by the way, if you actually go to North Carolina, so first he ends up in Charleston, South Carolina, then he goes to Fayetteville, North Carolina. If you visit Fayetteville, North Carolina, I think you can see that I believe there's a masjid named after him, and there's also an historical marker that is there, kind of memorializing Omar ibn Said. So he goes from kind of slave owner to slave owner. Some were quite cruel, but he ends up being sold to someone named James Owen, who he describes as being quite gracious towards him. They actually give him an English translation of the Quran, by the way, and he's given an Arabic translation of the Bible. So he has an English translation of the Quran, and then he's given an Arabic translation of the Bible by Francis Scott Key, who's the guy that writes the Star Spangled Banner. He's buried in North Carolina. He lives to about age 94. Now, here's the thing that I really want to focus on. Omar ibn Said leaves behind 14 manuscripts that he writes, all of them out in Arabic. And in addition to leaving behind his autobiography, which is extremely rare for someone enslaved to do that, he also leaves behind excerpts of the Quran. And here it is. Now his work, you can find it at the Wilson Library at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. That's where it is now, and that's appropriate. And what he does here is that he's going to leave behind excerpts of the Quran, and he's also going to tell his life story. And the argument is that at the end of his life, he must have converted to Christianity. And they say that because of the Bible, the copy of the Bible that he keeps. And also others of his contemporaries are going to identify him as Christian. But like I said, this is why the autobiography is so important. Because if you look at the autobiography of Omar ibn Said, again, you can actually see there's a critically annotated edition of it in this book right here called A Muslim American Slave. If you look at the autobiography of Omar ibn Said, he uses language that perhaps hints that he is still a Muslim. In fact, when we actually, Shah Hassan and I actually gave a presentation, Omar ibn Said, some years back. And when you look at what Omar ibn Said is writing here in his autobiography, you see that this is someone still writing as a Muslim. These are the efforts of a very elderly man. It's actually quite poignant and bittersweet. These are the efforts of an elderly man who is now in his 90s, who is trying to recall the Quran that he learned as a child. Because if he had followed the trajectory of learned Muslims from West Africa, then he probably would have memorized Quran at a very early age. But keep in mind, when he's captured, he is, let me see. So he's captured, he's born in 1770, he's captured in 1807. So he's probably, he's in his 30s, we think, when he was captured, and he dies at age 94. So he ends up living the majority of his life, obviously, under captivity. So what you really have in the autobiography, in my view, these are the efforts of a very elderly man trying to reach far back into the recesses of his memory and remember the Quran that he learned when he was very young. It is really, really remarkable. And what he does is he makes some mistakes in remembering. So for example, he writes down, I believe, Surat Al-Nasr. Yes, so what he does, like, there are places where he kind of like transcribes one surah with another. So for example, I think he's trying to remember Surat Al-Nasr, and he kind of has part of Surat Al-Nasr there, as well as Surat Al-Fatih. Al-Fatih, Inna fatahna laka fathan mubina. Surat Fatih is chapter 48. Surat Al-Nasr is at the very end of Juz Amma. So rather than his autobiography being evidence that this was kind of a Muslim who kind of assimilates to Christianity, I think that his contemporaries at the time kind of heard what they wanted to hear, and they wanted to believe that as kind of a sign of civilization that this West African Muslim had become Christian. But in reality, what he's trying to do is, as a very elderly man, he's trying to reclaim some of that narrative for himself. So we need to ask ourselves, one of the things I want us to think about, right, kind of connecting us to this present moment, is that, that we often kind of take being Muslims in this context for granted. And we'll would we be able to, some years from now, remember the Quran by memory and write it out? Will our children be in the position that they can sit down and write out the Quran from memory? Because remember, we are the custodians of these narratives. We are the custodians of these memories. And the challenge that the West African Muslims or the African descendant Muslims faced is that they weren't able to transmit to their children the way we're able to transmit to ours. So back to my comment about, do we have communities at this time? Yes and no. Some people like Bilali Muhammad, who I'm going to talk about in just a moment, are able to actually be in community with their family. But it's not the same for other enslaved Muslims who are not kind of allowed to be in a setting where they're able to kind of organize around being Muslim. We know that one of the features of chattel slavery context is that families are often divided. Family members are going to be split apart. Children will be sold away from parents. So that makes it very difficult for someone, for example, like Abdurrahman Ibrahima, to be able to kind of pass on Islam to the next generation. So that's a lot of information that I've presented there. But again, I wanted to present kind of details of their lives as well as my own views in terms of, do they assimilate? No. The same I said about Abdurrahman Ibrahima, I don't think so. I believe these men remain Muslim to the very end of their lives. Let's see if there are any questions or comments. And then inshallah, I'll have to excuse myself for Maghrib prayer. All right. So did Omar ibn Said, do we have any, let's see, does he have children? I know Abdurrahman Ibrahima did. For Omar ibn Said, I don't know that he had children. Let me double check and see. Inshallah, I'm going to double check my notes and come back to that, because I know that Abdurrahman Ibrahima, he does have children. And he ends up being repatriated, I think, to West Africa, but his family tragically is not. All right, inshallah, I'm going to double check and come back to that question on Omar ibn Said. All right, good. Let me see. There is the question, yes, Thomas Jefferson and others may have used the Quran in formulating the US Constitution. Yeah, Jefferson was quite erudite, and he definitely had a copy of the Quran in his library, which you're absolutely right, is now held in the Library of Congress. Okay. Any estimates to how many African Muslims were here originally? Estimates are very hard to come by. Like I said, there's a belief that anywhere from 15 to 40% of the enslaved population may have been Muslim. Inshallah, I'm going to check my notes and see if we have any actual numbers. All right, because numbers are a bit hard to come by. By and large, historians hold that these were exceptional individuals. And by the way, we know a lot more about enslaved men than women. And that's simply because not as many women were brought over or were able to survive the Middle Passage. So back to this question of Omar ibn Said, let me see if he had children, because the challenge that these men are going to face is that they're not finding from amongst the enslaved population Muslim women to marry. Abdurrahman Ibrahima marries a Christian woman. Bilali Muhammad marries a Muslim woman, but that's actually quite rare in the experience of enslaved Muslims. All right, so inshallah, two things I want to come back to: Omar ibn Said's family, and I'm going to see if I have any estimates. Michael Gomez, whose book I don't have here at home, but Michael Gomez has written about, he has a book called Black Crescent, I think. And in that book, Michael Gomez might actually have some numbers in terms of how many African Muslims might have been here. All right, so inshallah, I'm going to have to step away from Maghrib prayer. So just bear with me, inshallah ta'ala. I'll come back in a few minutes. But during that time, just let me know if you have any questions or comments. When I come back, inshallah, I'm going to be focusing, because time, is short. This is a presentation meant for obviously probably in 2 classes. So inshallah, when I come back, I'll answer the question on Omar ibn Said. I want to talk more about Prince Abdurrahman, as he was called, because he came from a noble background in Africa, and Bilali Muhammad in particular, because I actually wrote a paper about him. And I want to consider overall kind of the legacy of these enslaved African Muslims. And then we're going to look at this idea of an interruption and then Islam reemerging in the early 20th century. All right, so Jazakumullah khairah, everybody, and I will be back, inshallah, in just a minute. Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Let's go ahead and resume. In the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Sorry, the Maghrib sunset prayer is going to go out, before the end of class. Okay, so did Omar ibn Said have a family? No, he didn't. So, because I was, and that's why I couldn't think of anything when that question was posed, because are you all able to hear me? Is sound on, or am I on mute?
Yes, it's fine. It's fine.
Okay. All right. Very good. All right. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. All right. So yes. So Omar ibn Said did not have a family, which is not something, by the way, that's uncharacteristic. So again, here's the book. Here is his autobiography, A Muslim American Slave, The Life of Omar ibn Said. So this is actually what it says here about his autobiography. Omar ibn Said's life, i.e. the autobiography that he leaves behind, i.e. the excerpt itself is fairly short, but it's still remarkable that he leaves this document behind. He did not raise a family in the US, perhaps too aware that masters, as the author is saying, perhaps too aware that masters usually disregarded slaves' familial ties and often separated children and spouses. His life does not elaborate, i.e. his autobiography does not elaborate on his family life in Africa, and does not describe a lot about his birthplace after he mentions his kidnapping. All right. So there's a lot that we have to kind of read kind of between the lines to understand someone like Omar ibn Said. And as the author notes, multiple facets of his identity. He's an Arabic speaker. He's a Muslim, comes from the Fula or Fulbe ethnic group, a West African informant, an American slave, an anti-colonizationist, is how he's described in this book. There's another question that was asked, and that question is, like I said, it's hard to answer that type of question that's on data because we just don't have hard and fast numbers in terms of the Africans that were brought to these shores. Because as I mentioned, when it comes to sort of how Africans are being treated, they're being treated as human cargo. All right, that is, unfortunately, that is the reality. And so many people die in that middle passage. For the people that make it here, it's just really nothing short of a miracle they're able to endure that middle passage. But I did find something here, I think for this, one of the sisters asked potentially, I can't remember who asked that question, but here it is. This is an excellent book right here, Servants of Allah by Dr. Sylviane Diouf. African Muslims enslaved in the Americas. This book is an absolute classic. Again, the author is Sylviane Diouf, Diouf. And she writes here in terms of data on Muslims in the Americas. This is what she writes. Again, she's the expert. Muslims were scattered all over North, Central, and South America and the Caribbean. But exactly how many crossed the ocean and how many actually landed is unknown. No precision regarding the religion of their human cargo appears in the document produced by the slave dealers and the trade companies. But one way to arrive at an estimate would be to study the number of Africans who were deported from areas where Islam was present. And that's really what most scholars do. You're going to look at Africa itself. You're going to study the number of Africans who were deported from areas where Islam was present. Such as Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Mali, Benin, Ghana, and Nigeria. However, the actual number of Muslims in West Africa at any given time up to the 20th century is unknown and would vary based upon area and era, i.e. you'd have to be knowledgeable about Islam and patterns of Islamicization in West Africa itself, okay? So she says suggesting figures for the Muslim presence in the Americas is, under these conditions, highly problematic and risky. However, this is what she notes to answer your question. The latest figures for the transatlantic slave trade are based on data collected from close to 35,000 voyages, about 80% of total voyages, as well as estimates that propose that, this is amazing, 12.5 million Africans were deported. And then this is when she gives the breakdown based upon kind of region in Africa. And ultimately what she concludes is to be sure there were hundreds of thousands of Muslims in the Americas. And for the time being, that may be all we can say about numbers and estimates. But what is important is that whatever their region of origin and their ethnic heritage, the Muslims shared a set of values, a common language, i.e. Arabic, a similar education, and a lifestyle that, without erasing certain differences, made them part of a global community or Muslim ummah. And they were definitely the pioneers of Islam in the Americas. All right, and may Allah reward them for all that they had to endure. So I hope that helped to answer those questions. I want to look at Abdurrahman Ibrahima, because he's a very interesting person because he is able to have a family. But as I noted, he is not able to, he doesn't marry a Muslim woman. So, Islam, unfortunately, is not able to pass Islam to his descendants, rather. But who was he? So he was born in 1762, died in 1829. And he came from a princely background from the Fouta Djallon region of what is present-day Guinea in West Africa. He was sold to slave traders and ended up in the United States around 1788. And when the person who, quote unquote, owned him, Thomas Foster, learned about his background, he began referring to him as Prince, a title that he kept until he passes away. Imagine that he spends 40 years in slavery. And he is freed in 1828 by the order of US President John Quincy Adams. And this is after the Sultan of Morocco actually requests his release. A really, really fascinating person. And, the reason why he's able to kind of gain the attention of the authorities and ultimately be emancipated is that he's going to petition on the basis of the fact that he comes from his aristocratic background in West Africa, on the basis of his literacy, on the basis of the Arabic language. That's how he's going to end up being emancipated. But I want you to understand this. Unfortunately, the emancipation of Abdurrahman Ibrahima is not going to extend to his children necessarily. Okay, he uses his knowledge of kind of West African agricultural practices to become very successful in terms of rising to a position of some responsibility on the man's plantation. But again, he never loses sight of his desire to return home. And this is one of the things that historians debate. How much of a desire did West African Muslims have to actually return home? In the case of Abdurrahman Ibrahima, he actually manages to get a letter back to Africa. And the way he does this, again, I'm summarizing this, the way he does this is that he meets a journalist who is actually a Dutchman. This journalist takes the letter and gets it to the US senator from Mississippi, because Abdurrahman Ibrahim is in Mississippi at this time. That's where the plantation was. So the senator from Mississippi actually does forward Abdurrahman Ibrahima's letter to the US consulate in Morocco. Morocco is really kind of like that entry point to the Muslim world and to kind of West Africa specifically. He is identified, by the way, as a Moor because of the fact that he writes in Arabic. And the Sultan of Morocco reads the letter and asks the president, to John Quincy Adams, to release Abdurrahman, and they agree to do that, okay? The stipulation, though, is that he has to be repatriated to Africa. He cannot live as a free man in the United States. Remember, this is before the Emancipation Proclamation. He and his wife are emancipated. However, this is the tragedy. He's not able to raise the funds to free his children. He goes to Africa, becomes ill, never sees his children, never gets to his hometown in Africa, by the way. He dies in Liberia. All right, so that's Abdurrahman Ibrahima. So like I said, this idea of narratives of loss, he's able to get to Africa, but not his hometown. His children are still enslaved. All right. Okay. The book, I'm sorry, I mentioned a lot of resources. The book it's called by Michael Gomez. It's called Black Crescent. All right. And that's where you're going to, that's where he does, I think, is present some data on the West Africans who are enslaved, or as Dr. Liu says, deported. And note, I'm saying enslaved, right? I'm not saying slaves. I'm trying not to use that word, because when we use the word slaves, I think that is language that is just dehumanizing. These people were not born into slave status. They were living their lives, often from very noble, successful backgrounds in West Africa, when they were sadly victimized in the Atlantic slave trade. All right, so Abdurrahman Ibrahim, and by the way, there's a documentary, which was the link for that was emailed to everybody, and that email that Brother Hussam sent. Make sure you watch that. It's a beautiful film, Prince Among Slaves. I'm not going to spoil the ending for you, but there's an assumption made that this man, oh, he must be a Christian because he's so civilized. But at the very end of the film, we'll just watch it, okay? We know that he remained a Muslim always. All right, may Allah have mercy on all of them. So now Bilali Muhammad, it was really interesting to me because he's from Georgia. And let me actually, so I want to pull up the Sea Islands and Sapelo Island in Georgia, because that's where he's from. By the way, there is a fantastic resource to learn more about African-American Muslim history at sapelosquare.com. It's named for Sapelo Island, where Bilali Muhammad was. So, you know, it's a beautiful place to visit. So I'm just going to go ahead and kind of share my screen real fast. You can kind of get a sense of the geography of the region. All right, so here we are. So this is where I'm going to argue, my dear brothers, my dear sisters, where you have more of a community. Why? Because this is an island. That island acts as kind of a natural barrier against the outside world, and it allows a certain degree of isolation that Bilali Muhammad and his family are going to benefit from. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. And okay, here we are. So this is, if you've had a chance to visit these coastal areas of Georgia and South Carolina, they're really beautiful. This is called the Low Country, by the way, and they're known for the Gullah Geechee culture. The Gullah Geechee culture is a subculture within the African American community, where the Gullah Geechee people have retained a lot of connections back to West Africa in terms of language, dialect, cultural practices. It's really, really fascinating. So here's the term, right? It's the Gullah Geechee culture, right? And let me just make sure I'm spelling that properly. Okay, yeah, there we are. So again, this is the area called Low Country, Georgia and South Carolina primarily. So this is where Bilali Muhammad, he's going to live. You see Sapelo right there on that map, Sapelo Island. That's where he is with his family. All right, here's the resource, sapelosquare.com. This is put together by Dr. Saad Abdul Khabir. It's where she curates everything relating to African-American Muslims. It is really, really awesome. Make sure you all bookmark sapelosquare.com. Then, right, if you're actually interested in visiting Sapelo Island, as you can see, this is a tourist website, obviously, curated by, by the managed by the state of Georgia itself. So, but again, it's really, really fascinating in terms of, if we were to actually time travel back to this time and look for a Muslim community, we would end up going to Georgia, off the Georgia coast, and this is where Bilali Muhammad. This is where he was based. So who was Bilali Muhammad? Let's go back to the slides. Like I said, I don't believe the photo is of Bilali Muhammad. It's one that pops up when you kind of look at local newspapers, but I would have to kind of investigate further to kind of see the accuracy of this photo. So with Bilali Muhammad, off the coast, the coastal area of Georgia, one of the things I was kind of thinking about is how Bilali Muhammad's descendants actually retain memories of his practice of Islam, which is fairly unusual. So if you kind of look at the role of historical memory amongst African Americans, it's a very unusual thing to actually find a family that sort of through kind of a few generations is actually able to remember that someone had been Muslim in their family. Now, of course, there are many, and let me clarify this, there are many African-American Muslim families today where you have second, third, even fourth generation, all right? But to actually be able to go back to a certain time in US history and to actually interview folks who say, wait a minute, there was someone that kind of, she would use certain terms or have certain practices. And that's actually just really intriguing. The US government is actually going to embark on they're going to send people to actually do kind of like ethnographic research amongst the African American descendants of the enslaved Low Country enslaved persons. And they're actually going to find people that are reminiscing about practices that are clearly Islamic practices, which is really, really, really amazing to me. All right. So that's just to kind of give you this background in terms of why Bilali Muhammad is so significant. So here is kind of a picture here. Okay, here's a number for you for the sister who asked, was it sister or brother? Please remind me. Here we are. This is Michael Gomez. This is another book that he writes called Exchanging Our Country Marks. So in this book, Michael Gomez estimates that of the 481,000 Africans who came to British North America during the slave trade, nearly 230,000 came from areas influenced by Islam. Okay, it is therefore reasonable to conclude that Muslims may have come to America by the thousands, if not tens of thousands. And he says a more precise estimate is difficult to achieve. Now, we do know someone who becomes very prominent amongst them. And this is Bilali Muhammad. The context is colonial Georgia, okay, i.e. this is well before the Civil War. And Georgia is really kind of interesting, by the way, because Georgia, for nearly 2 decades after the colony was founded by James E. Oglethorpe, that was the founder of Georgia, Georgia was the only place in colonial America where African forced labor was not utilized. All right, so again, for the first 20 years in Georgia's history, Georgia as a state, it did not actually allow slavery. However, that's because British authorities, to an extent, were trying to ban the importation of slaves to that particular colony. However, by 1750, okay, by the mid-18th century, 1750, this policy is reversed. And now Georgia is going to join South Carolina in becoming a major center of plantation slavery. And in particular, you're going to find rice plantations. And what's going to happen is this is where these kind of planters are going to leverage the knowledge and skills of the Africans that they are enslaving and bringing from West Africa. And they're going to actually favor bringing in people from rice producing regions of Africa, especially Senegambia, Sierra Leone, and the Windward Coast. All right, and these are areas where Muslims tend to dominate, especially Gambia and Sierra Leone. They have a substantial Muslim presence and people who have knowledge of rice cultivation. So what does this mean? Like, in other words, why do we care about this? The reason why we care about this is because when these planters are looking for people from rice cultivating regions of Africa, that actually allows in these coastal areas that you actually now have aggregation. By aggregation, I'm saying that you actually have persons that might actually share similar ethno-linguistic backgrounds and cultural contexts. Because remember, Africans are living in diaspora, which means that you have a number of different ethnic groups, language backgrounds, and religious affiliations all sort of mingling together. But in this, right, so which kind of flattens out these differences amongst enslaved Africans. But when it comes to kind of these island and coastal areas, what it means is a fairly high percentage of West Africans enslaved in this part of Georgia are going to share some ethno-linguistic similarities. So what this means is that this actually affords Bilali Muhammad the possibility of actually being able to marry a woman who's Muslim, which, like I said, is quite unusual. We don't really read a lot about women amongst the enslaved population being Muslim. So what I argue in this paper that I wrote about this, what I argue is that the concentration of enslaved persons from specific regions in Africa would give rise to 2 important features of Georgia enslaved communities. And specifically, number one, that the Georgia Low Country, i.e. these coastal areas I showed you on the map, would have the largest number of Muslims in North America, and that these low country enslaved persons would be characterized by more cultural and linguistic homogeneity than other slave populations. And that's why, again, you get the Gullah Geechee presence in the Low Country, who still maintain a lot of African cultural practices and linguistic connections to West Africa. And then we get, even more interestingly for our purposes, documentary evidence. Because remember, documentary evidence is evidence that cannot be sort of as easily kind of lost or erased from history. And this is where Bilali Muhammad is very, very fascinating to us. So Bilali Muhammad leaves behind a manuscript. Here it is, right here. It's probably at the library, University of Georgia at Athens, I believe. And what Bilali Muhammad, what he leaves behind is a document that basically is indecipherable to everybody around him, because you know the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants around him are not able to read Arabic. So they assume that he must have been writing a diary. They actually call the document, I'll tell you what they actually call it, it was called for the longest the Ben Ali diary. His name, Bilali Muhammad, somehow becomes Ben Ali, and they call it the Ben Ali diary. And it's not really discovered until much later on what this document actually is. So Bilali Muhammad lived again on Sapelo Island during the first half of the 19th century, i.e. the 1800s, okay? First half of the 1800s. And this book that people call a diary, it's actually discovered that this book contains excerpts from a Maliki legal text. Right, this is the Risala of Ibn Abi Zayd. So this is a Maliki legal text that this has excerpts from. More than likely, this was a text that Bilali Muhammad was introduced to during his early years in Africa. Now, I don't believe Bilali was a member of the ulama class. He's fairly young when he actually is brought to these shores, probably early 20s or so, if I'm not mistaken. So I don't know that he would have had the opportunity to receive extensive formal legal training. In fact, when Nigerian contemporary Nigerian ulama looked at the document, they were a little bit puzzled, trying to kind of make sense of some of the errors. I mean, there were kind of errors of grammar and syntax and misspellings in the book, which again is understandable if you have, like in the case of Omar ibn Said, an elderly man trying to recall his early education in West Africa. So again, it does contain excerpts from Maliki texts, which is very plausible. You're in West Africa, and he probably would have received instruction in Arabic, and he definitely would have received instruction in Islamic law and the Maliki school of law. Now, there were other Muslims in this area. So sometimes he's confused with someone named Saleh Bilali, who's someone you might also read about if you read accounts of this time. So there was 30 miles to the south on St. Simon's Island, all kind of the general area off the coastal area of Georgia, was Saleh Bilali, who was called Tom. And like Bilali Muhammad, Saleh received Arabic instruction. Okay, but I don't know that he necessarily left behind a written document behind. But even if, by the way, you know, Bilali Muhammad only had possessed maybe partial, not full literacy, the fact of the matter is, right, whether it's full or partial literacy, this is remarkable in a time when slaves could be captured, beaten, or even worse for actually learning how to read and write. So their linguistic ability, you know, was more than just a curiosity. Their linguistic ability actually embedded these enslaved brothers in a global Muslim community whose common language, whose lingua franca was Arabic, and actually gave them certain stature in the eyes of the people who owned them. Okay, so what kind of relationship may the Bilalis in Georgia have had with the slave owners? Some of that we kind of have to read between the lines, because one of the questions that kind of arises when I teach this class, and by the way, inshallah, I'm going to make sure to leave time for Q&A at the end. So we're going to go for probably about 15 minutes to wrap everything up, and then we're going to have Q&A. So one of the questions I was kind of interested in was, is it possible for these enslaved Muslims to manifest resistance? And what I would like you all to think about here is, isn't the very kind of act of documenting your narrative an act of resistance? Even when, in the case of Omar ibn Said, sort of the people around him are going to try to kind of use that narrative for their own purpose. Ultimately, his narrative has reached us to this day, and it actually kind of allows that narrative to stand on its own, to speak for itself. It actually allows us, right, some, I don't know, 150 years later, to draw the conclusion this man remained a Muslim to the end of his life. So one of the things we have to think about is, how does resistance look at this time? And that was really kind of intriguing to me because, when it comes to kind of like slave rebellions, the sense that we get sometimes looking at US history is that there really was not much evidence of slave rebellions. In fact, if you're kind of looking at the way that history is presented, maybe in the context of public schools, middle schools, and high school, we don't really get a sense that there was much resistance at all. And of course, that, the fact that the curricula leave that out is really kind of deliberate. So there's a reason, for example, that people like Nat Turner and John Brown are demonized the way they are. There is, for the longest, the kind of the script that was being promulgated was that slaves, enslaved persons, were somehow content with their status. They were happy on the plantations. They were happy to kind of become Christianized and so on. My mother, for example, who's African American, she'll tell you that growing up and going to the public school system in Detroit, that she would just kind of dread going to those, going into that history or social studies lesson, because Africans, and this is, again, the 1950s or so, Africans are presented as kind of being the uncivilized, savage other, not contributing anything to kind of world civilization, that, the sum total of African American history was just kind of happy slaves on this plantation. And she just, as an African American child, she dreaded going into that classroom. Now, fortunately, in the 1960s, we're going to see scholarship that's going to upend that narrative, with African Americans rediscovering their African roots. I think about the autobiography of Malcolm X. I think about As Told to Alex Haley. Alex Haley, I probably mentioned this last time, Alex Haley is just really pioneering in that his family manages to kind of pass down certain information from their African ancestors. And what they're able to remember to actually pass down, they pass down names, and place names. And he's able to take that information, names of African ancestors, and the place they came from in Africa, and actually trace his ancestry back to the family's original village in Gambia. It's just really, really fascinating. And what happens is that, when Alex Haley, when he writes his autobiography, Roots, there's the accompanying television series that really kind of revolutionizes television, I think in the 1970s or 80s, 70s, probably when it comes out, because for the first time, audiences are getting this kind of like visual depiction of the horrors of slavery, when before it was all just happy slaves on a plantation and Southern belles and hoop dresses and whatever, which is just, again, propaganda. So one of the things that I want us to think about is, what does resistance look like? Resistance means remembering. Resistance means being able to transmit something to the next generation. Resistance means writing down your story in Arabic, writing down the fiqh texts you remember, writing down the surahs of the Quran you remember. To me, those are forms of resistance. Now, certainly there were armed forms of resistance, but I want you to understand that the United States is very different, say, from other kind of colonies, say colonies in Central America, colonies in South America. If you consider the case of, well, let me actually ask you all this, where does the only successful slave uprising in the Western Hemisphere actually take place? All right. The only successful slave uprising in the Western Hemisphere is Haiti, absolutely. Under Toussaint Louverture, amazing Haitian general. But the French made the Haitians pay dearly for it. Can you imagine? The French actually made the Haitians pay billions in reparations to France for fighting for their liberation, right? While the French are calling for, liberty and fraternity and equality, this is what they do. So, and the reason why this is possible is because, like I said, there's a certain degree of that island serves as a natural barrier, and there's a certain degree of isolation. And because the Black population outnumbers the population of planters and and enslavers, that is possible. Whereas in the United States, it's very different. Even in a place like these coastal areas off of Georgia, I'm going to give you some stats here, right? McIntosh counties where Bilali Muhammad lived, this is in Georgia, Blacks outnumbered whites by almost a 4-to-1 ratio in 1810, and by a 5-to-1 ratio where Saleh Bilali lived in Glenn County. Yet what you actually see here is not, sort of kind of open forms of resistance, even with Blacks outnumbering whites. Instead, you see more passive kind of forms of resistance. And what I'm going to argue in terms of documenting memories, in terms of leaving behind this book that Bilali Muhammad leaves behind, in terms of trying to keep the family together, in terms of kind of transmitting values and practices. One fact that my students always kind of find quite puzzling here is that, and by the way, I think this is also a testament to the man's Muslim character, mashallah. When the War of 1812 happens, that's when Britain, is going to attack the United States. And the War of 1812, the owner of the plantation where Bilali Muhammad lived, a guy named Thomas Spalding, so trusted Bilali Muhammad. Listen to this. He gives him firearms and leaves him in charge of the plantation. And Bilali Muhammad promises that he and the other Muslims would fight the British to the death in the event of an attack. All right, now, was Bilali Muhammad really going to do this, right? Allahu A'lam, but the fact of the matter is that he is left with weapons in charge of this plantation. All right. So what do we make then, right, of people like the Bilalis, right? Are they kind of acquiescing to the powers that be, right? We kind of think about dramatic slave uprisings. Think about Brazil. That's another great example, right? In Brazil, there's a more kind of sort of a militant form, in terms of those slave uprisings. A lot of slave uprisings take place in Brazil, often led by Muslims. So what is different in Georgia? And I think what I'm going to argue here is that what was different for Bilali Muhammad is that he is here with his family, right? There's a consideration that he has. He has a wife, he has children. If you actually go to Sapelo Island today, you're actually going to find his descendants. There's a woman named Cornelia Bailey. Let me type her name here. If you look her up, there's a woman called Cornelia Bailey who actually writes about her ancestor, Bilali Muhammad. If you go to the church on Sapelo Island, you'll actually find the church still has Al-Fatiha written in the church, i.e. these were Muslims at one point. So what I'm going to argue is that perhaps armed resistance was not possible for someone like Bilali Muhammad, because he might have seen himself as having kind of a stake in trying to keep together that community in the form that it existed. And what does Bilali actually end up doing, my dear brothers and my dear sisters? He preserves his Arabic language. He wears distinctive Islamic garb, right? This is Georgia in the 1800s. Openly practices Islamic rituals of prayer and fasting, Eid prayer. They actually observe this. And the reason we know this is because what happens is about a century later, this is during the early 20th century, the United States government is going to actually commission people who are going to do ethnographic research, and they're going to talk the descendants of people like Bilali Muhammad. So this brings me to the point that I wanted to kind of wrap up our discussion with. All right. What do we kind of make of? So you have Bilali Muhammad, kind of mid kind of 1800s. Then you've got Civil War, 1861 to 1865. Then you've got the Reconstruction, an attempt to afford African Americans a certain degree of political and social and economic rights. Then you have the imposition of Black codes, Jim Crow, and another century of struggle before you have the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s and 60s. Again, just kind of compressing that. So my question is, if you have people like Bilali Muhammad who are practicing Muslims in Georgia in the 1800s, does Islam disappear from the North American landscape and not reappear until, for example, we see the nation of Islam in the 1950s, for example, right? It's an intriguing question that scholars are looking at. Like, what happens at the end of the 1800s? What happens in the early 1900s? Is there any semblance of Islam in this country? So does Islam disappear? So what's going to happen is there's in the 1930s, okay, this is going to be around the time Elijah Poole meets Farad Muhammad in 1930s Detroit. That's the beginning of the Nation of Islam. In the 1930s, the US government sends researchers to Savannah, i.e. the coastal area of Georgia. And what they do is they interview Bilali Muhammad's great-grandchildren. Two people, there's one person called Katie Brown and then Shadrach Hall. And this is the late 1930s. And this is just remarkable to me. They sit down with the researchers and they share recollections of Bilali and his wife. Her name was Phoebe and she was Muslim. And they said that they prayed several times a day. They used traditional Muslim prayer beads. They read the Quran. They wore distinctive clothing, observed Muslim fast and feast days. Now, remember, Bilali died around 1859. He does not live to see the Civil War or the Emancipation Proclamation. So these great-grandchildren of his that are being interviewed in the 1930s obviously probably would not have had a chance to meet him, but they hear stories, right, from their own parents and their grandparents, where again, the memories of Bilali Muhammad and his family are being passed down. They're clearly devout Muslims. But the question is, does Islam die out by the time you get, say, to Georgia, the 1920s and 1930s, right? What happens on Sapelo Island? Does Islam disappear from the African-American landscape during Civil War and Reconstruction? Why do African-Americans embrace Christianity the way that they do, but not hold on to Islam in the same way? These are all questions that are really kind of ripe for research, okay? Now, let me kind of leave you with this anecdote. And perhaps we're not maybe kind of looking at things with maybe the most kind of sort of imaginative perspective. So this is something I want you to think about, all right? At the same time that these researchers interview Bilali Muhammad's great-grandchildren off the coast of Georgia, they also decide to observe the local African-American community. And this is what they do. They find a man who's a preacher. They want to find a kind of a religious leader. So they interview a preacher and listen to how, by the way, this is 1930s. Listen to how they describe him. They visit Sapelo Island. They interview a preacher they intriguingly describe as quote unquote tall and spare, with brown skin, narrow face, and a thin pointed beard. Guess what they call him? They describe this man as a Mohammedan-looking Negro, is what they call him, a Mohammedan-looking Negro. His name was Preacher Little, and he wore a black skull cap. And his service was, the religious service he leads was puzzling to them. They'd not quite seen anything like that. They describe the service as consisting of that he reads a text followed by a sermon, which the interviewers describe as in no way connected with the text. Preacher Little divided his sermon into 3 parts and lectured his congregation on staying on the path. And this is really intriguing because reading this as a Muslim in the 21st century, if I didn't know better, I would say that these researchers stumbled on perhaps some type of, Allahu Alam, adaptation of what would have been a Jum'ah service, complete with a bearded imam wearing some type of kufi or skull cap, delivering a potentially from the Bible and the Quran. Again, this is Georgia in the 1930s. So with that, I want to kind of leave all of us with the possibility that when you have people like Elijah Muhammad from Georgia, by the way, or let's see, Timothy Drew Ali from North Carolina, going to the north in the Great Migration, people who, to be honest with you, are really only a couple generations removed from the descendants of Bilali Muhammad, right? Is it not possible that there might be some connection, even if it's a connection of historical memory, of sentiment, of remembering, that makes them receptive to these forms of kind of proto-Islam you're going to see emerge in the urban centers of the early 20th century United States with the Moorish Science Temple and the Nation of Islam? It's an intriguing question, and I think one that really is, I think, ripe for exploration. All right, so with that, inshallah ta'ala, I just kind of want to see if anyone has any questions, comments, or thoughts. And I've referred to proto-Islamic movements. So what that means is that, for example, people like Bilali, Muhammad and Salih Bilali, Amr ibn Sa'id, Abdurrahman Ibrahima, these were practicing Muslims. But then what we have in the early 20th century, right, we have the emergence of proto-Islamic movements. And these are movements that are going to sort of take aspects of Islam and Black nationalism, and sometimes some aspects of Christianity, to kind of proffer a platform for Black empowerment and uplift. And you see these movements emerging in the early 20th century in places like Detroit and Chicago. But what I want you all to note here is that I think it's interesting that the founders of these movements are people that are coming out of the deep South, and they are going north in the Great Migration. Questions, comments, thoughts? There's a question about, should we do a reflection? Absolutely, inshallah, if you feel so moved, I would love to get some reflections. If you've not had a chance to write one, I'd love to get a reflection or feedback for this class. I'm going to actually share some reflections from last week in just a moment. So, of course, time at this point does not really kind of allow me to kind of exhaustively kind of look at these early movements in the 20th century, but inshallah, while we kind of think about our questions and comments, there are a couple of things, inshallah, that I do want to say about these movements here. So this is, as you can see, a picture of Elijah Muhammad and Clara Muhammad. They are from Georgia. They leave Georgia in the Great Migration, escaping just the sort of brutality that really haunts so many aspects of African-American life in the Deep South. Elijah Muhammad very famously says that I think that if he saw Georgia, like he doesn't want to see Georgia again he says if he saw Georgia in 20,000 years, it would still be too soon for him, I think is what he says. They end up in Detroit, or outside of Detroit, and it's actually Clara Muhammad that introduces him to Farad Muhammad, who was the original founder of the NOI. Kind of he's kind of a person that's a bit, there's some ambiguity in terms of who was Farad, what did he actually claim, but by the 1930s, he kind of disappears from the scene, and Elijah Muhammad has taken over the reins of the organization. And that is the organization that Malcolm X is going to join in the 1950s and rise to prominence as the national spokesperson of the Nation of Islam and the leader of the famed Temple number 6 in Harlem, all right, which becomes the Mosque of Islamic Brotherhood today. So this is, again, what Dr. Sherman Jackson calls these proto-Islamic movements. And of course, while in terms of their aqidah, while these are not obviously mainstream or traditional Muslim beliefs, we have to understand that the Nation of Islam is able to very successfully marshal certain terminology and symbols and ideas. And if we were to actually kind of time travel back to the US, the 1950s and 60s, even the 70s, in part, the profile of Islam in America would very much be a Black American profile. Imam Warath Muhammad is a son of Elijah Muhammad, and very famously in 1975, when his father passes away, he brings his father's followers into mainstream Islam, and which I think really makes him a mujaddid of his time, a renewer of the faith. It's a title that people kind of didn't want to give to him, but for everybody who looks back at that period of history, to take people who have these beliefs about the white man being the devil and other kind of beliefs that of course don't find support in Islam, to take them kind of out of that NOI kind of ideology into Islam was nothing short of remarkable. May Allah reward Imam Warath Muhammad eternally for that. Okay. All right, so there is a question which I'll answer in just a moment. Prior to the Nation of Islam, you had a very interesting group called the Moorish Science Temple. These were African Americans that were led by a person called Timothy Drew or Noble Drew Ali. And they kind of positioned themselves as being Moors. They're African Americans, but they kind of they didn't want to be, again, this wasn't an effort to kind of transcend the limitations imposed on African Americans. So they eschewed this quote unquote, they eschewed a Negro identity in favor for being recognized as kind of like sort of the sovereign group called Moors. And you still have remnants of the group that exists today, by the way. But again, there's a very kind of interesting kind of marshaling of symbols, of garb, of terminology. They had a book that they read that they called the Quran, but in reality had nothing to do with the Quran. But this is a group that emerges, as you can see, in the early 20th century. A lot of their members actually end up kind of going into the Nation of Islam. And even before, another person I should mention is this person right here. Before you get the Moorish Science Temple and the Nation of Islam, you have this phenomenal person, Marcus Garvey, the leader of the United Negro Improvement Association. And he was one of the most successful Black entrepreneurs of the early 20th century. And he had a following of millions of African Americans at the height of his movement. And the U.S. government labels him a Negro agitator, and they deport him back to the West Indies where he was born. All right, this is Marcus Garvey, had a newspaper, was trying to get a steamship line started, and was very much promoting a message of Black economic self-sufficiency and uplift, and was seen as a threat by the U.S. government. And by the way, Malcolm's father, Earl Little, was a Garveyite. He was a member of this movement, and he ends up paying for that with his life. And then last but not least, before we get to the questions, I want to note that it wasn't just the proto-Islamic movements we see in the early 20th century, where the beliefs are quite heterodox, i.e. not in line with mainstream Islam. You also had traditional Muslims during this time, also from the West Indies. His name, you had Sheikh Dawood Ahmed Faisal, who was married to a sister they called Mother Khadija, and they established the State Street Mosque in New York. Before that, it was the Islamic Mission of America, but by the 1940s in New York, you had a very diverse, robust Muslim community out of the State Street Mosque. And this is a remarkable, remarkable evidence of Sunni Muslim organizing amongst African-American Muslims in early to mid 20th century United States. All right. And they were very much traditional Muslims in their teachings and practices. Okay. And this is actually a photo. Here we are. This is actually a photo of Sheikh Dawood Ahmed Faisal and the community. As you can see, they're very diverse. All right, let's answer some questions now. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So I pray this has been of benefit, and I tried to bring everything together, in these two lectures. I hope this has given you a good overview of early Islamic history in America, and it has, inshallah, opened up some avenues for research and reading for everybody. Question here: Will the indigenous people be questioned by Allah the same way as everyone else? So, this is a really interesting theological question. And the way that I would answer this question is, you have to understand that Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran that he does not punish until he sends a messenger. All right, let me find that ayah for you. So let me find it in just a second. So I'm going to give you the citation. So that's something I want you to keep in mind. Just give me 1 second here. I'm going to have this for you, inshallah. So there's something called the idea that the people Ahl al-Fatra, which I'll talk about in just a moment. 1715. It's chapter 17, Al-Isra, verse 15. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. وَمَا كُنَّا مُعَذِّبِينَ حَتَّى نَبْعَثَ رَسُولًا. So here's the ayah. This is chapter 17, verse 15. Whoever is guided is only guided for the benefit of his soul. Whoever errs only errs against it. And no bearers of burden shall bear the burden of another. And never would we punish until we send the messenger. So there's this ayah in the Quran, and there's also what Muslim theologians, people like Imam al-Ghazali and others would argue. And they would argue that, because this is a question people have asked, what is the fate of non-Muslims in the afterlife? And what many Muslim theologians will do is they will distinguish between people who are outright kuffar i.e., these are people that received a messenger, or they received the message, a very clear message of truth, in a way that was just very apparent to them that this was the truth. But because of whatever reasons of arrogance against Allah Ta'ala, they decide that they don't want to accept this, and they disbelieve. So when it comes to the fate of that person in the afterlife, the Quran is very clear about that person's fate. But what theologians will argue is that it's not possible to kind of consign people to hell if people either did not receive a messenger, or did not receive the message in a very clear way to where they understood that this was the truth of La ilaha illallah, Muhammad Rasulullah. So that's how they would respond to that question, that it would not behoove us as Muslims to say, okay, those people are going to hell simply because they died as non-Muslims. And I've heard mashayikh speak about this. Like, for example, could you take somebody, and I don't know, just to someone an example of this, right? Could you take somebody in Bolivia in the year 1650 and say, okay, khalas, this person? No, I mean, how can we say that, right? We simply can't. This is something that's really only known to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I think, in terms of what happens if people are given the message and they don't believe, this is something that's between them and Allah Ta'ala. The Prophet himself was told, peace and blessings be upon him, about even his closest relatives, right? And he wanted them so much to believe, people like Abu Talib, and the Prophet himself was told that it's not possible to, ask forgiveness for someone who dies upon polytheism, right? So that's something that we keep in mind. We ask Allah to reward people for the good they used to do, but in terms of final judgment, that belongs solely to the realm of Allah Ta'ala. All right, God the Exalted. But thank you for that question. I appreciate that. Okay. There is a question about the NOI. The NOI, again, it kind of goes back to the first question that was asked. When people are clearly presented with this is what Islam is, and they still persist in those beliefs. Again, keep in mind, this was not a class on theology. I understand this is a diverse group, so kind of bear with me that theological questions are coming in. The Nation of Islam argues that the reason why they still cling to certain heterodox beliefs, this is the argument they make. This is when you ask people who are from the Nation of Islam themselves. I remember asking someone this question, who was a kind of a leader in the mosque there in Chicago, in terms of why the Nation of Islam still prints a certain kind of, if you look at their newspaper, the Final Call, there's kind of a statement probably on the last page or so of that newspaper in terms of what Muslims want, what Muslims believe. And it very clearly states or presents certain heterodox beliefs. And the argument that they make is that the Black man is still not and the Black man, specifically in the American context, is not quite ready for Orthodox traditional Islam. That has to be kind of approached in kind of stages, is the argument that's still made. It's not one, of course, that I agree with. All right. Yes. Yeah. The names are very interesting. So with naming practices, so naming practices within members of the Nation of Islam, kind of reflect an overall sentiment that you're going to see amongst African Americans in the 1960s and 70s, that there needs to be kind of a sort of a rejecting of European names. And so that's where the X comes in, Malcolm X, the idea that surname is going to replace an X, because the European surname does not accurately reflect one's African ancestors. Don't really know what that ancestral surname is. So that's why you get the X with members of the Nation of Islam. The name Muhammad is one that is very popular amongst members of the Nation of Islam, absolutely. And it goes back to that encounter Elijah has with Farad Muhammad, whoever that individual was. Some opine he was from the Middle East, some say he was maybe from South Asia. Again, God knows best, all right? But then also you see around the time, for example, that my mother embraces Islam, before she actually becomes Muslim in the 1970s, my mother takes on an African name. In her case, she chooses a Swahili name, and she says to my grandmother, who's wondering, like, why did you choose this name, and you've changed the way you look, and what's kind of going on here? And my mom says that, look, she feels that this name, even though it's not the name of her African ancestors, because we don't have that knowledge, that this name more accurately represents her versus the name of a white British slave owner. All right. So that's why naming is so, that's why there's so much kind of symbolism and significance amongst the names that African Americans and African American Muslims will embrace. Because in changing that name is kind of a reclamation of that identity that was stripped away from the early African Muslims. All right, any questions, comments, thoughts? So I love teaching this subject matter, so I pray that you have benefited from these presentations. And I ask Allah Ta'ala to accept the efforts of everybody here, our students and our organizers of this event. And I appreciate all of you who attended over last week and tonight. All right, so inshallah, just a few more minutes to see if there are any questions or comments. Let's see here. Yeah, in terms of the name Muhammad Ali, I'm trying to remember. So I think that Muhammad Ali said that name was chosen for him by Elijah Muhammad. You know, Elijah Muhammad's an interesting case in the sense that he definitely knew about Orthodox Islam. And Elijah Muhammad does know that his son Warith Din is very much inclined to traditional Islam. And he places Imam Warith Din in charge of the NOI, by the way, which I think is quite telling. And I think this is definitely, let me see if I can find, inshallah. So there, I would love for you all to actually read more about Imam Warith Din Muhammad. Again, we just didn't have time to cover everything in this class, but his contribution is really, really significant, and how he takes over the NOI, the Nation of Islam, from his father in 1975, and begins this transition of thousands of his father's followers to traditional Islam. It's really, really remarkable. So I've got an article on that I can share with Brother Hassam if you're interested in that. Okay. All right, so Alhamdulillah, it's been a pleasure to teach this class. So I did not say a lot about my family background last week, so I thought it might be helpful for you, for those of you who might be wondering, why am I teaching this class in African American Muslim history? And it's because of my own background in terms of kind of having both the experience of kind of like African American conversion to Islam, as well as like the immigrant transnational experience. So my mother was born in Detroit and became Muslim. My mother's African American, and she was born in Detroit, and she became Muslim in the mid 1970s. And it's very interesting because she actually introduced my dad to Islam, and his background is Lebanese. And because his family came to the United States as part of what's called the Mahjar, which is that kind of influx of people from the Holy Land to the United States, and also South America too. So my great grandfather came from what was then the Ottoman Empire, but is today Lebanon, in the 1890s. So it's really, I think it's a story that probably only could have happened in America, that you have somebody from, subhanAllah, from Arab background who comes to the United States, meets a Black woman, and becomes Muslim. It's an amazing story, mashallah. So that's that. So I'm eternally indebted to my parents. Their journey was just remarkable. Both grew up as Christians and found Islam. My mother went all over the world, and hers was very much a journey of kind of reading and kind of studying. And then my dad, mashallah, what becomes, she talks to him, he becomes Muslim on the spot. It's just really, really remarkable, subhanAllah. Again, a very American story. It's funny, when we visited my dad's kind of extended family in Lebanon, and kind of met some distant relatives, they were trying to puzzle the whole thing out. They said very interestingly, they're like, wait a minute, طلعوا مسيحيين رجعوا مسلمين, like, how do you do that? How do you leave Lebanon as Christian and go to America and come back as Muslim? Like, how does that happen? So the way that Allah Ta'ala writes these things, right? SubhanAllah. And of course, definitely coming up in the 60s, becoming Muslim in the 1970s, the autobiography of Malcolm X was hugely important and formative for them. And by the way, I usually have my copy of the autobiography here. I'm trying to see if I can find it. Just give me 1 second, because if there's one book that I want you all to read, it is the autobiography of Malcolm X, which I normally have here in my office. It's just that I have so many books, mashallah, that I'm trying to keep track of. Here it is. Yes. So if there's one book I want everybody to read, definitely read the autobiography of Malcolm X. Okay. This is the academic tomes are good, mashallah, but read this one. Okay. It's an amazing story of transformation. One of the things about Malcolm X is that he meets a Muslim from Sudan, Dr. Ahmed Usman was his name, who actually gives him da'wah. It's a great story. So you'll have to look that up, inshallah. All right. Well, jazakumullah khairah, everybody. If we don't have any further questions or comments, yes, our organizer, Brother Hassan.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us over these 2 weeks. And inshallah, we'll get to hear some lessons from you again in the future, the Al-Hidaya community. And I believe there are some people who would like to speak and just say goodbye as well to you. So I'm going to allow them to talk. And if anyone else wants to say goodbye, just raise your hand and that would be great.
Jazakallah khair, Ustad Zainab. Thank you so much for giving us such great insight into this topic. It was really beneficial. Thank you.
Wa iyyakum, it was my pleasure.
Oh, we have more. Sister Majida.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How are you?
Alhamdulillah. I enjoyed it. Last week I lost out on some of them because I had a bad phone, and I got you this week. Alhamdulillah, I learned a lot from you, and inshallah, I hope you get some more classes. Inshallah.
I'm glad that you enjoyed the class. Afwan, may Allah Ta'ala bless you and give you good health. Thank you so much for being here.
Alhamdulillah.
And we have one from Sister Aysam. Sister Aysam, are you there? Okay, maybe she's having some difficulty. So in any case, Ustad Zainab, thank you once again for participating in this class and teaching us. We enjoyed all of it, and inshallah, we hope to hear from you again soon.
Inshallah.
My pleasure to be here, and I ask Allah Ta'ala to accept on behalf of all. And I really, after looking at these stories again for this class, I'm just just marveling, mashallah, at the sacrifices of our spiritual forebears and ancestors in Islam. And my dua, my supplication, I think, is I just ask Allah to let Islam be deeply rooted in the soil of this country and to let it flourish and to preserve Islam amongst our descendants. Amin ya arhamar rahimin.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care. Have a good evening.
Have a good evening. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you, everybody. Take care.